A black girl tells a millionaire, "I can fix his broken heart." What happens next will shock you. "Get out of here before I call security," David Blackstone muttered, without even looking up from the freshly covered grave. Her hands trembled as she held the bouquet of white roses that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The 19-year-old girl stood motionless beside the Italian marble mausoleum, her worn sneakers contrasting starkly with the $3,000 Italian shoes of the richest man on the West Coast. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love more than life itself," Keisha said softly, completely ignoring the threat. David finally looked up, his eyes red from crying, meeting her. "You don't know anything about me or my daughter. How dare you?" Her daughter Emma was 7 when she died in the accident. She loved to paint butterflies and always asked you to read her the same story about a brave princess before bed. Keisha's voice was firm but gentle. "And you've been here for 3 months straight, always at 2 in the afternoon, because that was when you used to have lunch together on Saturdays." The millionaire recoiled as if he had been punched. No one knew these intimate details. Not even her ex-wife, who blamed him for the child's death and had disappeared with half his fortune after their messy divorce. "Who the hell do you think you are?" David growled, his sadness quickly turning to anger. "Some intruder who?" "I'm someone who works at the hospital where your daughter spent the last 15 days of her life," Keisha interrupted, pulling a small folded drawing from her pocket. "And she asked her to give this to you when the time was right." David's hand shook violently as he recognized the crude drawing of a pink butterfly that Emma had made weeks before the accident. On the back, in the uncertain handwriting of a 7-year-old, was written, "Daddy, don't be sad forever. I want you to be happy again, his." For a moment, the cemetery was completely silent, except for the sound of a billionaire man trying not to break down completely in front of a stranger. "You don't understand," David whispered, clutching the drawing to his chest. "I destroyed everything. Because of my work, because of my selfish choices. She died because of his fault." Keisha watched this powerful man fall apart before her eyes, and something in her gaze revealed that she knew exactly what to do with all that pain. Something that went far beyond simple compassion. It was the look of someone who carried his own devastating secrets. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice carrying a determination that made David stop crying and pay attention. "I can mend his broken heart. But first, he must be willing to discover the truth about what really happened that night." What the billionaire didn't know was that the young woman standing before him held information that could not only change his perspective on Emma's death, but completely revolutionize everything he thought he knew about justice, redemption, and the true power of revenge served with wisdom. If you feel your soul being touched by this story of pain and hope, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how an impossible encounter between two opposing worlds would turn into something no one could ever have predicted. 3 weeks after that meeting at the cemetery, David Blackstone would discover that accepting Keisha Washington's help would be the most dangerous decision of her billionaire life. "You said you could fix my broken heart," David murmured, sitting in the leather chair in his office on the 40th floor. "But since that day, I can't stop thinking about what you said about finding out the truth." Keisha looked out the panoramic window at the city stretching out below her. Her simple clothes contrasted starkly with the obscene luxury of her surroundings, but her posture betrayed a confidence that didn't match her apparent social status. "Mr. Blackstone, what do you know about the driver of the truck that hit Emma's car that night?" "Marcus Webb. 23 years old, construction worker. He was drunk when he—" David couldn't finish the sentence, the trauma still tearing at her throat like broken glass. "And what do you know about who paid his bail? Or who hired the best lawyers in town to defend him? Or why he was sentenced to only 2 years in prison for manslaughter?" David looked up slowly, a shadow of confusion crossing his face. "What are you implying?" Keisha opened a folder she had brought with her and slid some photographs across the table. Marcus Webb wasn't alone that night. He was leaving a private party on a yacht anchored in the harbor. A party organized by someone you know very well. The photograph showed a young Marcus staggering off a luxury yacht, clearly drunk, while in the background a familiar figure smiled for the cameras. Jonathan Crawford, a minority partner in David's company and the son of one of the most influential families on the West Coast. Jonathan Crawford was the one who offered Marcus drinks all night. It was Crawford who insisted that he drive the company truck even though he was drunk, because it was more fun that way. And it was Crawford who paid all the legal fees to ensure that Marcus only spent 2 years in prison. David felt the world crumble again, but this time in a completely different way. "That's impossible." Jonathan was with me at the board meeting that night, discussing the merger with the German company. No, Mr. Blackstone. You were at that meeting until 11 o'clock at night. Emma died at 2 in the morning. And Jonathan was celebrating something very specific on that yacht. Keisha slid another document across the table, detailed bank statements showing astronomical transfers from Jonathan Crawford's personal account to offshore accounts, all made in the week following the accident. Celebrating what? David whispered, but a terrible part of her mind was already beginning to understand. Emma's death meant that her company would be vulnerable. A grieving father is not capable of making complex business decisions. And if something happened to you too, say, an accident caused by depression and guilt, Jonathan Crawford would inherit control of the company through clauses you yourself signed, trusting her like a brother. David grabbed the edge of the desk, his fingers turning white. You're telling me that Jonathan, that he orchestrated my daughter's death to steal my company? I'm not saying, Mr. Blackstone. I'm proving it. Keisha placed a digital recorder on the desk. Marcus Webb was released from prison 3 weeks ago, and he recorded this conversation with Jonathan Crawford 2 days later. Jonathan's voice echoed through the silent office. Listen, kid, you did your part of the deal. Old Blackstone is destroyed, just like we planned. Now we just have to wait for him to kill himself with booze and guilt, and I'll take over. His 2 years in prison were worth $20 million. Not a bad deal. David stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. His hands trembled with a rage he had never felt in his life. Why? Why are you showing me this? Keisha calmly put the documents back in the folder, her movements revealing an organization and methodology that did not match the image of a simple hospital employee. Because I don't work at the hospital, Mr. Blackstone. I work for a private investigation agency specializing in cases that the traditional justice system cannot solve. And because Emma wasn't the first child Jonathan Crawford killed for money. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of David's heavy breathing as he processed the magnitude of what he had just discovered. Mr. Blackstone, Keisha said, standing up and walking toward the door, you have a choice. You can choose to continue destroying yourself with guilt over something that was never his responsibility. Or you can choose to make Jonathan Crawford pay for every tear he made her shed, for every night he made her wake up screaming Emma's name. She stopped at the door and turned to face him one last time. But if you choose the second option, you need to understand that this will not just be a quest for justice. It will be a war. And Jonathan Crawford has resources, influence, and connections that will make our mission extremely dangerous. What David Blackstone didn't know was that agreeing to enter this war would be only the first step in a plan that Keisha had meticulously crafted over 2 years, a plan that would involve not only the destruction of Jonathan Crawford, but the exposure of a network of corruption that connected the most powerful families on the West Coast to crimes that would make Emma's death seem like just the tip of a terrifying iceberg. David Blackstone spent the next 2 weeks living a double life that would test the limits of any professional actor. During the day, she kept up her usual routine, board meetings, business lunches, international calls. Jonathan Crawford remained by his side as his loyal partner, offering fatherly advice on how to get through the grief, and increasingly insistent suggestions that David might need a long vacation to process everything. You look tired, my friend, Jonathan said during a board meeting, his hand resting on David's shoulder with her feigned concern. Maybe it's time to consider handing over more responsibilities to other members of the team. You know you can trust me to take care of everything. Thank you, Jonathan. You've always been like a brother to me, David replied, each word burning his throat like acid. I don't know what I'd do without her loyalty. But when the sun went down, David became something completely different. For the past 14 days, he had been meeting secretly with Keisha at strategically chosen locations. A cafe in the old part of town, a park bench in an abandoned park, the public library where no one from the business elite would ever set foot. Mr. Blackstone, I need you to understand something, Keisha had said during his third meeting, spreading photographs across a table hidden in the back of the library. Jonathan Crawford isn't just a greedy murderer. He's at the center of an operation involving at least 12 billionaire families on the West Coast. The photographs showed a complex web of connections, suspicious bank transfers, meetings on luxury yachts, forged documents, and at the center of it all, Jonathan Crawford orchestrating what appeared to be a massive corporate manipulation scheme. In the last 5 years, 7 children have died in accidents whose parents were CEOs of companies that were later absorbed by corporations controlled by this group, Keisha continued, her voice cold as ice. Emma was just the latest. David felt his hands shake. 5 years? You've been investigating this for 5 years. No, Mr. Blackstone. I've been investigating this for 15 years. Keisha pulled a photo from her pocket, a little black girl smiling next to a man in a suit. This is Aisha, my younger sister. She was 8 years old when she died in a car accident. My father owned a small tech company that developed revolutionary software for bank security. David looked at the photo, then at Keisha, slowly connecting the dots. Jonathan Crawford was at the funeral. He offered his condolences to my father, and 2 weeks later, he offered to buy the company to honor Aisha's memory. My father, devastated by grief, sold it for a fraction of its real value. Keisha carefully put the photo away. 6 months later, that software was being used by the largest banks in the country, generating billions in profits. That's when David realized he wasn't just dealing with an investigator. He was facing someone who had dedicated 15 years of his life to a mission of justice that would make any Hollywood thriller look like child's play. I have allies, Mr. Blackstone. People Jonathan Crawford would never suspect could pose a threat. Over the next week, David was discreetly introduced to the clandestine network Keisha had built over the years. Marcus Webb, the driver who had killed Emma, had been working secretly for them since his release from prison. He came to me, Keisha explained. Jonathan threatened to kill him if he said anything, but Marcus has a daughter the same age Emma was. The guilt was destroying him. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a forensic auditor specializing in corporate financial crimes, had lost her son in similar circumstances 3 years earlier. She now worked undercover at various financial institutions, meticulously tracking every suspicious transaction made by Jonathan's group. And then there was Thomas Chun, an investigative journalist who had lost his career after trying to expose part of the conspiracy 5 years ago. Jonathan had used her influence to destroy Thomas's reputation, but that only motivated him to work in the shadows, gathering evidence that could one day bring down the entire corrupt system. Each of us has a personal reason for being here, Keisha said during a meeting in an abandoned warehouse that Thomas had converted into a makeshift operations center. But you, Mr. Blackstone, have something we never had. What? Access. Jonathan trusts you. He thinks you're just a broken, predictable man, incapable of posing any threat. That arrogance will be her downfall. Over the next few days, David began to use that trust against Jonathan in subtle but devastating ways. He recorded conversations during business lunches where Jonathan admitted, unaware that he was being monitored. He copied files from the company's shared computer during meetings when Jonathan left the room. He photographed confidential documents that Jonathan casually left on her desk, convinced that David was too depressed to pay attention to business. He's getting more and more careless, David reported to Keisha after a particularly productive week. Yesterday she openly showed me an acquisition agreement for a company whose CEO lost a son in an accident 2 months ago. She laughed and said, "Some people are just lucky with timing." Keisha smiled for the first time since David had met her, but it was a smile that promised storms. Mr. Blackstone, the first phase of our plan is almost complete. We already have enough evidence to destroy Jonathan Crawford publicly and send at least half of his accomplices to prison. First phase? David asked, realizing that something much bigger was going on. Jonathan Crawford is just the beginning. The real prize is the entire network, all the families, all the companies, all the politicians and judges who make this system of corporate murder possible. Keisha looked out the warehouse window, his eyes shining with a determination that made David realize he was dealing with someone whose thirst for justice was as deep as the ocean. But before we get there, Jonathan needs to pay personally for Emma, for Aisha, and for every child he helped kill. And when the time comes for revenge, Mr. Blackstone, it will be her who will carry it out. David felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that his transformation from grieving father to instrument of justice was just beginning. Thursday's board meeting will be the perfect moment, Keisha continued, pulling a small electronic device from her pocket. Jonathan plans to officially propose that his removal from the company be effected for emotional instability. He has already prepared the documents and secured the support of enough board members. How do you know that, Because Dr. Martinez hacked his email last night. He's so confident that he didn't even encrypt the messages. Keisha laughed dryly. Arrogance really is the hallmark of successful sociopaths. David looked at the device in Keisha's hands, realizing he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. For 15 years, Jonathan Crawford had orchestrated the murders of innocent children to amass wealth and power. For 15 years, she had slept peacefully, believing her social position made her untouchable. Thursday, David muttered, feeling a strange sensation growing in his chest, something between terror and a dark satisfaction that he had never experienced before. Thursday, Keisha confirmed, Jonathan Crawford will discover that underestimating a father seeking justice was the biggest mistake of her privileged life. What David didn't yet know was that the revenge Keisha had planned for Thursday would be just the opening act of a much bigger show, a show that would involve live television, evidence that would shock the entire country, and a revelation about Keisha's own identity that would change everything he thought he knew about justice, revenge, and the true price of power in a society where children are treated as acceptable collateral damage. Thursday, 9:30 a.m. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Blackstone Industries was more crowded than it had ever been. Jonathan Crawford adjusted her Italian tie and smiled discreetly at the 16 members of the board of directors. He had spent the previous week ensuring that each of them would vote in favor of her proposal for David Blackstone's temporary leave of absence due to emotional instability. "Gentlemen, before we begin our meeting," Jonathan said, rising with the confidence of someone who believes he has everything under control, "I would like to propose a protective measure for our company. As we all know, our esteemed CEO has been going through an extremely difficult time following the personal tragedy." David remained seated, seemingly resigned, absent-mindedly leafing through some papers. "Please, Jonathan, continue. I'm curious to hear your proposal." "As I was saying," Jonathan continued, handing out copies of a legal document, "I believe it would be prudent for David to take an extended medical leave. 6 months, perhaps a year, to properly process his grief and—" "Interesting," David interrupted softly, standing up and walking over to the projection screen. "You know, Jonathan, I also prepared a presentation for today. Something about loyalty, trust, and, well, murder." The smile on Jonathan's face faltered for a split second. "David, perhaps this isn't the appropriate time for—" "Oh, I think it's the perfect time." David connected a laptop to the projection screen. "Especially considering that this meeting is being broadcast live to all of our international branches, our majority shareholders, and coincidentally, to the country's major news networks." The room fell completely silent. Jonathan looked around, noticing for the first time the small, discreetly positioned cameras that hadn't been there the week before. "David, what the hell are you doing?" Jonathan muttered, his voice losing all of its previous confidence. "I'm doing something I should have done 3 months ago," David replied, clicking on the first slide. "I'm exposing a murderer." The screen filled with photographs of Emma Blackstone, smiling in the park, painting butterflies, sleeping with his favorite book. "My daughter Emma died 3 months and 22 days ago. All this time, I believed it was a tragic accident. That drunk driver Marcus Webb was solely responsible." Jonathan began to rise from his chair. "David, this is clearly a psychotic episode. Someone needs to—" "Sit down, Jonathan." David's voice carried an authority that made everyone in the room shiver. "Because I'm about to explain exactly how you orchestrated the murder of my daughter to steal his company." What followed was 20 minutes of the most devastating presentation any corporate boardroom had ever witnessed. David showed photographs of Marcus Webb leaving Jonathan's yacht drunk. He played recordings of Jonathan admitting to providing alcohol to the young man, because it was more fun that way. He displayed bank statements showing the $20 million transferred to Jonathan's offshore accounts in the week following Emma's death. "But the most revealing," David said, his voice maintaining supernatural control, "is this recording Marcus Webb made 2 days after he was released from prison." Jonathan's voice echoed through the room's speakers. "Old Blackstone is destroyed, just as we planned. Now we just have to wait for him to kill himself with alcohol and guilt, and I'll take over." His 2 years in prison were worth $20 million. Jonathan was now visibly pale, sweat dripping from her forehead. That could have been edited. You can't prove." "Oh, but I can." David clicked to the next slide, showing legal documents. "Because over the last 15 days, I've installed recording equipment in all of our shared offices. Equipment that captured every conversation you had with your accomplices." What followed was a brutal succession of evidence linking Jonathan Crawford not only to Emma's murder, but to a network of corporate killings that spanned 5 years. Catherine Morrison, 8-year-old daughter of the CEO of Technova Industries, killed in a bicycle accident 3 days before her father signed an unfavorable merger with her company, Jonathan. James Chun, 6-year-old son of the founder of Green Energy Solutions, killed by food poisoning the week his father refused to sell his revolutionary patent. Aisha Washington, 8-year-old sister of someone you'll meet soon, killed in a car accident that allowed you to buy her father's bank security software company for a fraction of its real value. With each name, each photograph of a dead child, Jonathan Crawford slumped further in his chair. Several board members were visibly shocked, some crying openly. "David, stop this," Jonathan finally exploded, standing up abruptly. "You have no idea what you're doing. You don't understand the forces you're messing with. There are very powerful people who—" "You mean people like Senator Williams? Or Judge Patterson? Or maybe Sheriff Morrison?" David smiled for the first time in months. "Because I have bad news for him, Jonathan. He's also being exposed right now." David clicked on another slide, showing a live feed from several other locations. As we speak, teams of investigators are presenting similar evidence in 12 other cities, exposing the entire corporate assassination network of which he is only a small, very small part. Jonathan looked desperately around the room, like a cornered animal. "You can't believe this. He clearly has a mental breakdown. This is revenge, not justice." "Revenge would be killing you with my own hands," David said calmly. "Justice is ensuring that he spends the rest of his pathetic life in prison, knowing that every family whose children she helped murder now has the truth." It was at that moment that the conference room door swung open and Keisha Washington entered, followed by an FBI team and the state's attorney. "Jonathan Crawford," said the lead agent, "you are under arrest for the murders of Emma Blackstone, Catherine Morrison, James Chun, Aisha Washington, and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in 12 other cases." Jonathan looked at Keisha, his eyes wide with recognition and terror. You're her sister." "Aisha's sister." "I am," Keisha replied, walking until she was face to face with the man who had destroyed her family 15 years earlier. "And for 15 years, I have meticulously built the network that has just captured you. Every ally, every piece of evidence, every step of this plan was dedicated to ensuring that you and his accomplices would never again be able to kill an innocent child." "Perhaps," David said, watching coldly as the man who had murdered his daughter was dragged out of the room. "But Emma will be able to rest in peace knowing that his killer has been exposed for what he really is, a coward who kills children for money." When the room finally emptied, leaving only David and Keisha, a heavy silence hung between them. "Mr. Blackstone," Keisha said softly, "the first phase of our mission is complete. Jonathan Crawford will never again be a threat to any family." David looked out the panoramic window, watching the city stretch out below him. For the first time in 3 months, he felt something resembling peace growing in his chest. "And the second phase?" he asked, intuitively knowing that there was still much work ahead. Keisha smiled, the same determined smile that had promised storms in the cemetery. "The second phase involves completely dismantling the system that made Jonathan's existence possible. And for that, Mr. Blackstone, we will need resources, influence, and a determination that goes far beyond personal vengeance." David turned to face her, realizing that his transformation from grieving father to instrument of justice was only just beginning. "We'll have both," he said, extending his hand to seal a partnership that would not only change their lives, but potentially save hundreds of children whose names they didn't even know yet. What David Blackstone didn't yet fully understand was that agreeing to work with Keisha Washington didn't just mean continuing a mission for justice. It meant entering a war against a system of power that extended to the highest echelons of government, where the true price of victory could be far greater than either of them was prepared to pay. 6 months later, David Blackstone looked out the window of his new office as he read the headline, "Corporate Murder Ring Dismantled, 12 Executives Sentenced to Life in Prison." Jonathan Crawford had been sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. His assets had been confiscated, her family had abandoned him, and he now shared a cell with common criminals who despised people who hurt children. "Mr. Blackstone," Keisha entered the office carrying a stack of letters. 300 more families have contacted us asking for our help in investigating the suspicious deaths of their children." David smiled for the first time since Emma's death without feeling guilty. He had turned the Emma Blackstone Foundation into the largest private investigation organization specializing in corporate crimes against children in the country. What about the other members of the network? David asked. Senator Williams was impeached and arrested. Judge Patterson lost his bench and is awaiting trial. 12 CEOs have been removed from their companies. Keisha smiled. Emma can rest in peace. David gently touched his daughter's portrait on the desk. You know, Keisha, Emma always said that when she grew up, she wanted to help other children. In a way, she's still doing that. The best revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you, it's turning her pain into purpose and building something that protects others from going through the same suffering. What about him? Has he faced injustices that seemed impossible to overcome? Leave a comment about how he reacted and subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that justice, even if it takes time, always finds a way.